Today I had the opportunity to talk to Justin Feinstein, PhD. He's a clinical neuropsychologist, and I met him about 10 years ago at a float conference. I became interested in floating about 14 years ago, and it had a huge impact in my life. I was on a hamster wheel, just like most people, and I found it to be such an amazing tool for slowing down and self-reflection. And I started floating pretty regularly at that time, and I even considered opening a float center. So I went to 4 different float conferences and met some of the leading experts in the field. And Dr. Feinstein is the leading expert in studying flotation therapy. He even has a center where he would study patients and see what the benefits were over the years. And the research is pretty revealing, and some of the results are amazing. So it's cool that he's putting a lot of the clinical data together to see if it can be something that can be used for PTSD, stress reduction, anxiety, things like that. And it's an incredible tool for first responders, for veterans, and for people that are just dealing with overall mental health issues. And it's also an amazing tool for athletes and for top performers, but also for everyday folks. A lot of people just don't know what flotation therapy is, and he's helped put all the data together to help people to understand the nature of what flotation therapy is. And if you've never tried floating, look up your local float center and make sure that it's a good one and that they use quality tanks, and schedule a float. I always encourage people to try 3 floats within a month or so, because the first one you're just getting used to the environment, and usually by the second and third float you start to really feel the benefits. Usually people's third float is when they get that aha moment. So consider trying it out. It's an amazing tool to slow down and to start to connect with your inner self. And a lot of people call this sensory deprivation, but it's actually the opposite of that. You get rid of the outside stimulation and you start to begin to amplify your inner experience. And you actually can almost amplify all of your sensory inputs. So Dr. Feinstein talks a lot about the nature of floating and why we would consider doing that. And Dr. Feinstein created a new project called Maui Calm, which is helping all of the victims from the fire and allowing first responders and everybody from the community to have access to free flotation therapy. So that's a pretty amazing feat, and he's almost there. So we'll get into some of this stuff. Look up your local float center and give floating a try. I'm always a big fan of it, and I think it helps pretty much everybody I've ever met. So enjoy the conversation, and don't forget to rate it on iTunes and Spotify. That helps people to discover the show. And enjoy this episode. All right, Dr. Feinstein, thank you so much for your time and joining me.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Yeah, I've followed your work for quite a few years, and I began floating, I think, 14 years ago.
Oh,
And
wow.
yeah,
You're
it
one
had
of
a
the
huge,
early floaters.
I guess, not really. It's been around forever, but when it started to build the Renaissance, I caught wind of it, and yeah, it changed my life, actually. It was my first introduction to meditation, really, and to calming the nervous system, and being a first responder, it's had a huge impact on me. So
That's incredible. Yeah, I'd love to dig into all those points that you just brought up because, you know, oftentimes I think people don't understand what floating or float therapy actually is. And there's a ton of names for it that I think are actually the incorrect name, the most common one being sensory deprivation. I think that's a complete misnomer. But the way you just phrased it, I think is perfect, which is it is an amazing tool for meditation, for calming the nervous system, and for helping people in high stress situations like first responders. So I think you summed that up perfectly.
amazing. Yeah, and you seem to be one of the first people that started to really study the benefits of floating, from what I gathered. I saw you speak at one of the float conferences, maybe, 10 years ago or so. And I remember you were just starting to build your lab. So maybe you could just discuss a little bit about that. And then I know you're working on some new projects. What's it called? You said Maui Calm Project. I'd love to hear about
Yeah.
that. And there's a bunch of stuff I'd love to dig into, but
No, excited to talk about Maui Calm Project. But yeah, I've been going at this now. I guess I had my first float a little bit after you, so around 2013, or maybe 2012, somewhere around then. I was doing a postdoc at Caltech in California, trying to understand the brain regions that are important for the processing and experience of fear and anxiety. And it was at that interesting moment that a research assistant in the lab sort of came up to me and said, Justin, you got to try this. I just did it over the weekend. It's called float therapy. You got to just try it. And, back then it was only described as sensory deprivation, and it actually scared the hell out of me. I was like, what? You want me to go into a box? I don't like enclosed spaces to begin with. So that was already a barrier to entry for me. But the research assistant was quite persistent, and she said, listen, what you're not recognizing in this name is that this therapy actually enhances the internal senses, which is part of what I was studying when it comes to the neuroscience of fear. It turns out the internal senses, especially as it relates to the visceral body, like the heart or the breath, are disturbed in states of anxiety. And patients who have chronic anxiety, have this sort of dysregulation or dyshomeostasis in the brain-body connection. And so I was fascinated by this notion that it could enhance your internal senses. And after 3 months of prodding me, she finally convinced me to try it. It was a really interesting first float experience, because I think around 10 or 15 minutes into the float, I was audibly laughing out loud into the float tank. And the laughter really came from a place of just being so amused by the fact that the experience I was having was the exact opposite of all the anxiety I had going into the experience.
That's awesome.
And that juxtaposition I felt from that very first float, where I was in such a relaxed physiological state. I could feel all my muscle tension, and so often in the case of stress or anxiety, we harbor that tension in our muscles around the back and the neck. And this float environment, this zero gravity-like state that is created in the float environment, just melts that tension away. I could feel my mind and my body just going into this very calm state. But then the juxtaposition of also feeling my heartbeat, hearing my heartbeat, feeling and hearing my breath in a way that was actually quite difficult. I'd been trying to meditate for over a decade prior to my first float experience, and especially mindful forms of meditation where you sort of hone your attention in onto the sensation of the breath, were always quite difficult. I remember going to a retreat, and you would sit there for days meditating 10, 12, 14 hours in a single day. And maybe in that long period of time, you would have this period of maybe 30 seconds or a minute where you're completely immersed in the sensation of the breath, the present moment, visceral sensation of the breath going in and out. And that is it. Your entire mind's focus is that, and there is nothing else. So you get that for a glimpse, and it's pretty profound, and you experience this relationship to the present moment that is unlike any prior relationship that you've had. But it was just a glimmer, right? Just a quick moment in time in a very arduous retreat. When people go on meditation retreats, these are difficult. You really have to focus and be able to withstand many hours, grueling hours of sitting, where your back's hurting, your legs are falling asleep, and you just try to keep practicing the art of meditation. But what I found in this float tank for the first time ever is it came with ease. That 30 to 60 seconds where I'm immersed in the sensation of my breath turned into 3 minutes, and then 6 minutes, and then half of the float. I was able to just meditate in this amazing environment that naturally filters out all of the external distractions that get in the way, oftentimes, of a deep meditative state, and naturally enhances the internal sensations which you're trying to focus on anyways, especially the breath. So I thought that was really fascinating, that juxtaposition where you could feel the visceral systems of the body, but in this totally relaxed physiological state, which, keep in mind, is the exact opposite state that somebody with stress or anxiety is normally feeling. Normally, when they're anxious, that's when they feel their heart palpitate. That's when their breath starts coming to mind because they're hyperventilating probably. And so right away after that first float, I remember getting out of the tank and saying to myself, what do we know about the science and the research behind using this as a tool to help people with clinical stress and anxiety, people who are really suffering from these conditions? And so I did a really deep dive into the literature, discovered that even though that the float tanks have been around in earnest since the 50s, and then in its modern form since the 70s, we had no data, no published data in people with PTSD and people with clinical anxiety. And so I really thought to myself, well, this needs to be tested. We need to understand if this is an effective therapeutic tool for somebody who's suffering from these very chronic conditions. And so there began, right around 2013, a really interesting journey into trying to study flotation therapy. And it started right away where I left Caltech and moved to the Laureate Institute for Brain Research and built really one of the world's first laboratories completely focused on trying to study float therapy and really understand how it works in the body and the brain and how it could be a potential clinical tool for those who have things like PTSD or clinical anxiety and are looking for non-pharmacological solutions. So we could talk more about that, but that was kind of the nexus point when I was a postdoc at Caltech and had my first exposure to this very novel environment.
That's amazing. And were you well received by your colleagues and by people that when you came up with this idea to create this float research, how was it received, or how easy was it for you to get funding and all of that? I'm sure it was quite a headache.
You know, I was met initially with a lot of skepticism. And I think some of my clinical colleagues were worried about, what are the potential adverse effects that could come from this novel float environment. And once again, a lot of this is a harbinger of, or I should say, it really reflects back to some of the older notions that got instilled back in the 50s and 60s about what sensory deprivation is, which once again, I believe is a misnomer for the float experience. And so I think there was definitely some worry about, are there adverse effects that we need to be worried about? So a lot of my initial research was really focused on safety. And actually last year, we just published the first NIH-funded float study. Even though floating was invented at the National Institute of Mental Health in the mid-50s by John Lilly and Jay Shirley, the NIMH and the National Institute of Health have never funded a single float study until very recently. And so we just published the results of that first NIH-funded study, and it was a safety study. And we had to really demonstrate in people who had clinical anxiety and depression and PTSD that when they float, it is causing no harm. I think that's a really critical piece. And we could talk about this as well if you want, but that was actually one of the most important reasons why MDMA just got denied approval from the FDA. It was not related necessarily to the efficacy, although there were some issues that they raised, but it was really more related to safety. And so all of our initial research over the past decade has really been focused on things like safety. What are the basic mechanisms of how floating is working in the body and in the brain? How is it changing our physiological state? And, trying to understand what are the signals of interest, who are the patient populations that are finding benefit in this unique environment. And we've really been focused on those questions the past decade. But, we did have to struggle to get funding. I applied for a lot of different grants. We did get some funding. So we were successful at that, but it took a lot of work. And I think that's been a big, hurdle over the past decade, is just establishing that initial base of clinical research to demonstrate safety, to demonstrate efficacy, and then to get the powers that be in the field of medicine to actually treat this as a serious modality. And, I have to say, it took about a decade to do, but we're finally at that point where we do have a good foundation now of solid data, peer-reviewed, and published in good medical journals.
Yeah, I love that. And I like that you're focused on that piece, the safety and the efficacy, because I've heard a lot about the MDMA trials, and I've even volunteered for MAPS over the years. And over the past couple of years, I started to really pull back and see a lot of the issues with the big boom in the psychedelic renaissance. And I'm seeing that there's been a lot of problems in the clinical trials, I'm sure you've heard, and they're not being reported. And there's a lot of issues with suggestibility and power dynamics, and then indoctrination elements to it. And there's so much potential harm when you have people in a room with somebody in a hypersuggestible state, which is why I love floating, is it's just you. And it's really just a hyper amplified version of meditation. And in our overstimulated world, it's the perfect antidote to the sensory overload. So I've always loved floating because it's really just you doing
Right?
self-reflection.
I think of the float tank or the float pool kind of like it's both the couch and the therapist at the same time.
That's right.
And it's a very unique environment for self-reflection, for trying to process emotion. That's what we found, is it's actually a very good environment to process heavy emotion because of the relaxed physiological background. And to me, that's a really important piece of why floating, is, at least in our research, has been found to be so effective in people who have things like PTSD, which is exactly what the MAPS trial was focused on, is using MDMA to treat PTSD. And when you think about what MDMA or ecstasy is doing to the brain, it's putting it into this background state where you're just filled with self-compassion and empathy, right? This inundation, if you will, of positive emotionality. And then at that moment is when they bring up the traumatic memory. And suddenly a new association forms where this really aversive memory that always came with, immense feelings of anxiety and guilt and fear and so forth, suddenly has this new association of self-compassion and empathy and being able to forgive and reprocess. And so I think that was very powerful in those MAPS trials, and the data bore it out.
Mm-hmm.
What I found in a lot of our initial float therapy trials is a similar sort of new association where somebody, say with PTSD, would say they're floating, they're very relaxed, and then they would say suddenly the traumatic memory just popped up while they're floating. But what they found so interesting is that it felt like the memory lost some of its fuel, some of its fire, if you will. And I think what's happening is they're in this relaxed physiological state where their blood pressure is lowered by 10 to 15 points, their muscle tension is reduced, all of their brain activity is slowed. And then suddenly, a traumatic memory doesn't have this fearful association anymore. It has a new association, one of relaxation. That's what they meant when they said the memory lost some of its fuel. And so I think that's a very powerful piece of what the float environment is doing, is it's creating this physiological backdrop from which you could process heavy emotions. And to me, I think it's actually quite a similar mechanism to what's happening in some of the MDMA trials, but it doesn't require any drugs. And you don't have any of these safety issues. One of the things that people don't often talk about with MDMA is there's typically this 2 to 3 day window post MDMA where your serotonin levels could be depleted and you oftentimes will feel quite depressed and amotivated. And that really wasn't discussed much at all in these studies. And I think that's an important variable, especially if you're dealing with people who already have clinical depression. You want to make sure that whatever you're doing to intervene isn't, temporarily making things worse. And if it is, you got to kind of track that. So I think that was one of the issues with the MAP study. But to me, I've always viewed floating as a non-pharmacological way to obtain some of these same really profound states that you're seeing in things like MDMA or other types of psychedelics. Even though I don't view MDMA as a quote unquote psychedelic.
Yeah, and another issue is when you start to go down that medical model of the psychedelic experience, you have to trust the people that have already proven a bad track record with the opioid crisis, the OxyContin, and other issues. And then also the trying to scale integrity with the people that you're going to have in the room, the therapists, and all of the people that are going to be sitting with those people in that non-ordinary state. And then, you're seeing that nobody's really talking about the addictive nature of ketamine. And we all know that history if you really dig into it. But now I'm hearing everybody talking about ketamine and all the positives, which are there and are potentially there, but there's a
And and
lot of
and, and
negative.
John Lilly, the founder of Floating,
Yeah, he got so
died.
addicted.
He died. What a lot of people don't realize is he died of a ketamine-induced dementia. It's not often discussed in the history books, but when you talk to a lot of the people who were closest to Lilly and his last years of life, which, by the way, he lived on Maui during his final years of life. It was a ketamine-induced dementia that was induced by a lifetime of ketamine addiction that went on for quite a few years, decades, in fact, caused serious physiological withdrawal, got in the way of him functioning at his full capacity.
Yeah.
And, people don't talk enough about that. Matthew Perry from Friends, they just released a report last week showing how devastating his ketamine addiction was. He was having to be shut up multiple times a day just so he didn't go into physiological withdrawal.
Yeah.
And so I think, that's a really big issue right now that our society is facing, is that whenever we find a new chemical, a new drug that helps relieve suffering in some way, shape, or form, very quickly our society becomes addicted to that drug. And if that drug has physiological withdrawal, like ketamine, like opioids, like benzodiazepines, right? Even SSRIs have physiological withdrawal. But if that substance has physiological withdrawal, you now put an entire population at risk of a lifetime of addiction.
Yeah.
And
And especially when the narrative is basically pushing it's all medicine and it's all healing instead of being more honest about the approach, which is this is a very powerful drug.
that's
And
exactly right. And FDA, is part of this story. FDA, I hate to say this because it's so embarrassing, but they rubber stamped the approval of Oxycontin with a label that said this is not addictive. And the head of the FDA who did that rubber stamping ended up working and getting paid over $500,000 a year at Purdue Pharmaceuticals several years later, after Oxycontin had already got the entire state of West Virginia and a good chunk of our population addicted. So that this is really a sad travesty that you know goes back many years in our country, where the FDA and the powers that be in big pharma are getting our society addicted to these very powerful drugs. And unfortunately, me as a clinician, me as a scientist trying to find novel treatments to help people with stress and anxiety and pain, it's so clear what is happening. It's so clear that this is a concerted effort where addiction is creating a vicious cycle of more and more money going to big pharma and to these drug companies. And it's a vicious cycle that won't end until our society starts to appreciate the power of non-pharmacological interventions like float therapy, like breath work.
Yeah. And a more
Like,
honest conversation about all of it, because it's always somewhat propagated as medicine, pain management, instead of just the more truthful nature of it. Because I lucked out when I found floating, it was through back pain. I had bulge 3 disc, terrible issue with my back. And of course, the first thing they wanted to do was make me pain free with medicine. And I lucked out because the opioid crisis had already taken place, and I had Google, and I found out all the terrible elements of it. And I'd seen people get addicted to it. So I never took any pain meds, and I found the most benefit floating. And so it really changed my life. And then I really realized my back pain was actually more to do with my mind not being right. And I was just overstimulated and too busy. And so it was that mind body connection piece that yoga teaches and that breathwork teaches that I found in that environment naturally. And I became very evangelical about floating. And I went to 4 of the conferences and I went, holy shit, this is really good stuff. And it's natural, free, safe, and effective and legal, you know? And so it's a beautiful environment for people, especially people in our culture that are so busy and we're so caught up on momentum that it's almost terrifying to slow down, because that's where you have to confront everything. And so your first few floats for most people are not always comfortable, but it's really medicinal because you start to deal with all of the stuff that's out of balance. And, the pharmaceutical industry is always looking at symptom management, and we've seen where that goes. It just gets management of symptoms, but you never get to the root of the issue. And then you become so addicted to these pain-free management symptoms, and it's like, oh, this is terrible for people. And I've seen people take their lives and ruin their lives, first responders, and then all of the people, our patients. We give Narcan all the time. And then you have to see also that the prison industry, it's like all of that is just illegal drug related. Meanwhile, the biggest criminals are these people that are pushing the drugs and making the most amount of profit. So it's really a situation here. And I'm glad that you're tuned into it and doing the research to show this stuff and talking about the negatives of the psychedelics too, because they're medicine and there is potential healing in them. I don't like to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I just think people need to be more honest about the conversation.
yeah, I think psychedelics have a tremendous amount of potential. I think there is going to need to be sort of a clear focus on the safety issues, and I think that's what the FDA was trying to get across during this last meeting. And hopefully, MAPS and other people will be able to generate that data, and hopefully, in a matter of years, this could be reevaluated and hopefully approved this time. But I think, like you're mentioning, what a lot of people in the psychedelic movement don't understand, what a lot of people in sort of this big pharma addiction cycle with opioids and benzos and ketamine don't understand, is that float therapy offers a lot of the same benefits that these substances are purporting to offer, but without the side effects. It's
Yep,
Zen
that's right.
without Xanax.
Yeah. And it
This
is
is
the best place to find the breath too, which is your best friend.
That's exactly right. So, I think it's really important what you're doing and conveying this message, because I think the vast majority of our population has never heard of float therapy. And if they have heard of it, oftentimes they haven't heard of it under this context, one of its medicinal properties.
Right. Yeah, I love what you're doing. And I'd love to hear some of the data that you put out on the benefits that you discovered for PTSD, anxiety, stress, pain, and hear like what you guys did discover in those studies.
Yeah, sure. I mean, first of all of this data and all of the peer-reviewed papers are available on my nonprofit's website, clinicalfloat.org. If you go to the publications tab, we actually have a repository of all the peer-reviewed papers that we've published, as well as others have published over the past few decades. And I think it's important to read the papers because, in my opinion, some of the best data was actually the patients themselves talking to me during their debriefing after the float and explaining how powerful this intervention was for them. And in our first study that we published, I guess this is going back now to 2018, I was so enamored with their descriptions of the float experience that I actually transcribed all of those debriefing interviews, and it's in the supplementary section of the paper, and all of that, you could download on our website. But in terms of the data itself, we've now published, I think, around 10 papers just from my laboratory alone, and there's been several other labs now studying this in other parts of the world like Sweden and Germany. But in our lab, our focus was really on the stress and anxiety related disorders and the effect of float therapy on people who are suffering from these conditions. And, starting with safety, once again, what was amazing to me is how safe this was. I created this really specialized laboratory that had physiological sensors that were monitoring vital signs while people were floating, had intercom systems so patients could speak to me during the float in case any adverse effects were happening. We were monitoring every single float session to make sure and ready to address any adverse effects that may happen. I was worried about everything from, people with PTSD having flashbacks to people with panic disorder having full-blown panic attacks. And in that first 2018 study, I literally sat in the control room and monitored every single float session just to make sure that this was safe. And quite frankly, what was amazing to me is how few side effects there actually were and how minimal those side effects were when they did come up. The most common negative adverse effect that we found was occasionally people would report some itchiness. And I think that was mostly related to the fact that you're floating in over 1,000 pounds of Epsom salt. And some people's skin might not have, the best reaction to that quantity of salt. But this was very minor, just a few percent of the time that we were seeing something like that. But in terms of negative psychological effects, which is what I was most concerned about, we weren't seeing any of it. I think in that first study, we had one participant who reported that they started feeling what felt like a panic attack coming on. And then suddenly, after a few minutes, it just settled down, and she said she went into the deepest state of relaxation she's ever felt in her life.
It's amazing.
So a typical panic attack, you would jump out of the float tank, you would escape. That's the typical behavior of a true panic attack. So it wasn't even a full-blown panic attack, but that was the only adverse effect that we found. Every other patient reported remarkably positive effects. They talked about, feeling a complete loss of the feeling of stress and anxiety, a complete loss of the muscle tension that they were holding in their body. They talked about the spontaneous induction of meditative states, which, by the way, we weren't giving people instructions in these studies. We were just letting the float environment do as it wishes. We didn't tell people what they were supposed to be doing during their time in the float environment. And they were talking about just suddenly feeling like their breath and heartbeat and becoming one with those sensations. And this is remarkable because a lot of them in the debriefing interview would say they would try to meditate in day-to-day life and fail. And what people don't realize is when you're stressed and anxious, your nervous system is in this future-oriented state. You're constantly worried about what's happening in the future. And so to get somebody in that orientation to focus on the present moment is quite difficult. And it's difficult for their nervous system, which isn't wired to be focused on the present moment. And so in some ways, what I found so amazing about those initial studies is the patients were spontaneously reporting to us that this environment was very therapeutic to them. And I think the kicker for me was probably the study that came out last month, the NIH-funded study. In that safety study, we had an arm in the clinical trial that we called the preferred group, where we let these patients with PTSD and anxiety essentially just select what is your preferred amount of time to float. You could float for a few minutes, you could float for a few hours, or somewhere in between. You select your preference. And Ryan, what was amazing to me is when you talk to somebody with severe anxiety or PTSD, and this is before they've ever floated, and you ask them, you're going to go into this environment all by yourself, with your own thoughts. How long do you think you're going to last? What do you think the average person with severe anxiety or PTSD says?
I would imagine they either said, I'm not doing it, or 5 minutes.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think the average was somewhere around like 10 or 15 minutes. I'll do this for 10 or 15 minutes and then I'll probably get out. And of course, in all of
Yeah, pick up right there.
yeah, so they could leave whenever they wanted to. But in this preferred arm of the clinical trial, on average across multiple float sessions, their preferred duration was 75 minutes.
It's amazing.
Which is 25% longer than the hour-long time period that we're using as our main group. Our main group is what we call the prescribed group, which is these patients are just going to float, once a week for an hour. But the preferred duration was actually 25% longer at 75 minutes. So that tells you something very important about the therapeutic effects in this population of people who are suffering from stress and anxiety. Their nervous system is actually craving that environment. So I'll leave it there, but we haven't talked about all of the physiological effects that we've measured over the years using different equipment, fMRI and EKG and blood pressure monitoring. So that was difficult. We could talk about that if you'd like, but to make a long story short, what we were finding is that the float environment was reflexively inducing a relaxation response in both the body and the brain. And when I say reflexively, I mean without any effort on the part of the person floating. Just by virtue of placing your body in this very novel environment, we were seeing these physiological changes. And they were quite significant. Blood pressure was probably the biggest change, on average about 10 to 15 point drop in diastolic blood pressure, about a 5 to 10 point drop in systolic blood pressure. But we were also seeing really remarkable changes in the brain. And to me, that's pretty incredible that an environment like this exists on Earth that is so safe, causes so few side effects, and could have so much positive benefit when it comes to both what's happening in your body and in your brain. And in people who are suffering from stress and anxiety, this could be one of those tools that could really fundamentally change their life, because it's going to give their nervous system the ability to cope in the real world again. And I think that is really where the next phase of research is going, is how does float therapy impact people in the real world once they're done floating? And I think that's where we're going to see some remarkable ripple effects from this amazing experience that the patients have all gone through.
Yeah, and I know that for most people, if they can go for that consistent first few floats and get past the first 2 or 3, it becomes that really big aha moment for most people if they can stick with it within a month or two. Because I know for most people I've talked to, including myself, that third float was the magic float. And same thing with breath work too. It's very similar in that way. When you start practicing, at first it's a little awkward and funky, but then you start doing it more. And usually by your third practice, you start to discover that capacity to really get curious about it and build a relationship with it and get comfortable with it and actually find peace with it. And floating really led me to a curiosity about the relationship between me and my own consciousness. And it became a fun thing to explore, and I think eventually people could also get that benefit without floating. You can lay on your bed now, or you can be in nature, or you can be in your everyday life and start to really introduce that same element to your everyday experience. So you don't have to keep going to float all the time. And now I used to go all the time, and now I go probably once a month or every few months when I need that little container. But I've learned how to really relax and find more mindfulness in my everyday experience. So I think floating doesn't have to be this ongoing. And that's probably why Big Pharma is not going to want you to have insurance for it. And that's why you're doing these studies, because people should have this covered. Firefighters and veterans and people that have severe PTSD and trauma and all those things and anxiety should be able to have this covered. But it's not like one of those things you have to keep going forever. You can start to cut back on it. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, we published a paper a year ago that was the first study to sort of look at how long do the effects last after a float is over in terms of the anxiety reduction, the relaxation state that it induces. And so we tracked people over time. We were pinging them every couple hours for a few days and just trying to see how long are these benefits lasting. And what we found was quite amazing, which is even 48 hours later, 2 days after the float was over, we were still seeing significant anti-anxiety effects of floating. And, to me, I think we should put that in context, because if you pop a Xanax or any type of benzodiazepine for your anxiety, typically anywhere from 4 hours to 8 hours afterwards, you're going to start feeling the anxiety percolating again. And then that's typically where you end up popping another pill, right? That's the pill popping culture of our world. Here we were seeing benefits not 4 hours or 8 hours later, but 48 hours later, right? We were outlasting the effects of a typical benzo by an order of magnitude,
Mm.
but we didn't require any drugs to do such. So, part of what my nonprofit is proposing to do is a head-on-head study between floating versus benzodiazepines like Xanax to show that actually this is a more effective anti-anxiety solution than what is currently being prescribed to millions of people. But going back to your question, in this study, we found effects that were lasting about 48 hours. We should have probably gone out to 72 hours. That was our final cutoff point. But my guess is right around the 72-hour point, things are going to start going back to baseline. So 2 to 3 days is a pretty nice window of time. So if you have pretty severe stress or anxiety, that tells you that you probably need to be floating once or twice a week, right? As your stress and anxiety levels get more under control, it would probably then shift to weekly or even monthly, like you're talking about. And I think everybody is going to find, as they continue to float on a more regular basis, they're able to sort of lengthen the time in between floats because they're bringing the tools to bear in everyday life. And they're starting to be able to feel relaxed in very anxious situations. And, case in point, I think, would be Steph Curry. Steph Curry's a big floater. Kaiser Permanente did a whole commercial with him floating. And when he talks about what floating is actually doing for him, it's really helping him stay relaxed in those fourth quarter situations where your adrenaline is pumping, where your heart is racing, and where most of us humans fail. But then you take someone like Steph Curry, who's floating on a regular basis, and now he has to make that final shot with a few seconds on the line. And you look at him, and you look at his body posture, you look at his face. He is so composed. He is cool as a cucumber. And he's able to stay calm in the face of the storm. And to me, that is what float therapy allows you to do in everyday life, is to remain calm when stress reintroduces itself in life. In fact, it makes you more resilient to stress. So to me, those are part of what I'm really excited about in this next phase of float research, where we are trying to go out into the real world and say, what are the real world implications of this therapy when somebody's being able to use it on a regular basis?
Right. And there's no withdrawals. Like the benzos are horrific withdrawals, and it can almost ruin and kill people. And
That's
I've
right.
heard horrific stories about withdrawals. So there's already a better case study there, just because you're not ever going to have a withdrawal from floating. And you could actually probably use floating for people that are coming off of those medications as a tool. And you could use it for addiction because it helps you to break that cycle and to start getting to the root of the problem, I'd imagine. And like you said, the calm is contagious, and it starts to really impact the family environment and everyone around you. So it starts to spread to the environment, which is actually a feedback loop that allows you to have a better environment because everybody else is starting to engage better at home or wherever you're at, if you're on the basketball court. And I feel like the same thing is true for breath work, which is basically the environment for floating, is where you learn how to engage the breath if you've never really built that relationship. And when you start to use breath work in your everyday life, it becomes a mindfulness practice and it starts to really regulate the nervous system. So I think breath work and floating combined would be the ultimate study. But it's already like you're probably overwhelmed with your parameters. But I actually have learned over the years so much different styles of breath work, and I facilitate it for large groups in a very calm setting, and we do very calming, grounding breath work. But it's just to give the average person that doesn't really go to yoga or go to the typical workshop the opportunity to just slow down, basically a float tank, but without the tank, and connect with the breath so that they can cultivate a relationship with the breath in their everyday life. And I'm thinking of your basketball example. My friend trains Sugar Sean O'Malley, one of the top fighters in the world. He's his breath coach and movement coach. And Sean is always doing calming breath work. And when he goes out to do probably the most extreme sport, he's very zen. And he really attributes a lot of it to his breathing practice. And I bet he would really love floating. I actually don't know if he's ever engaged with floating, but I'll have to ask Brandon if he does that as well, and maybe even have Brandon start referring his clients to the float centers.
I know a lot of people in the MMA world and boxing world who are using floating, both as a recovery tool because it does help post-workout, with muscle tension and just helping to, I think, calm some of the inflammatory states that come with an intense workout. But I also think it's helping people in the sport itself. It's helping enhance their performance because so much of your performance is affected by stress. And if you're able to stay calm in the midst of that stressful moment, you have an edge on your opponents now, a major edge. And I think that's why the best athletes in the world are using this. I mean, look at it. Novak Djokovic, arguably one of the best tennis players in the world. Every place he goes, you'll see pictures of him at the nearest float center floating. Tom Brady owns a float tank, right?
That's
So
awesome.
Steph Curry, we already spoke about. And so you're starting to see this pattern where, some of the best athletes in the world are honing their practice by using float therapy. And once again, it's an amazing environment for that. But I think it could translate to a whole slew of other people that aren't necessarily in that upper echelon of their sport. Like you were talking about, first responders would be an ideal example. Talk about a high stress job. Talk about a job that's physically and mentally demanding, one of the most on earth. Every day you're encountering potentially traumatic events and having to really react with heroism in the face of that trauma. So you need to be at the top of your game if you're a first responder. And the day in and day out toll of that job could cause burnout, could cause things like PTSD. And floating is a really amazing intervention, a preventative intervention to stop that from cascading, to stop the burnout from leading you to not being able to work anymore, or the PTSD from causing a debilitating syndrome. And here's how I know this is true. My research studies obviously point to it, but it's actually happening right now in the real world, Ryan. At the last float conference that I was at, um, I met somebody who owns a float center in Washington, D.C., that connected me with the International Association of Firefighters Center of Excellence. And for anyone who's a firefighter, my understanding is that the IAFF is the primary union for every firefighter in America and Canada, basically all of North America. And this Center of Excellence in Washington, D.C., is essentially the one place that if you're on disability because of things like PTSD, because of a fire trauma that caused it, or the burnout of your job that caused it, right? They will send you to the Center of Excellence to get treatment. And for the past few months, I've been meeting with the medical director, Dr. Abby Morris, who's treated hundreds of firefighters using, guess what? Float therapy. With
That's
great
amazing.
success, no side effects. And keep in mind, this is part of a whole treatment protocol that she's devised focused on the ailments of first responders and firefighters in particular. But really, one of the centerpieces of that program is flotation therapy, and she's getting great results in the real world. So I think, Ryan, maybe you're the best testament to this because you said you're also a firefighter or were a firefighter.
Yeah, for almost 20 years now. And, I found it early on in my career, and it's done wonders for me because not only the stress of the job and the traumas we see and those types of things, but the sleep deprivation. And now you hear Huberman and different scientists doing studies on yoga nidra states. And basically, that's what you get into in the float tank super fast without needing all the years of practice. So it's like, I think we can really recover if I have a really rough shift or a couple of them in a row and I go float. It's such an incredible, rejuvenating, replenishing system for my body. And I try to implement that into my everyday life. I take short naps and I try to get into these deep states now because of floating. But a lot of people don't realize the benefit too for sleep deprivation and shift work, and nurses and anyone who's doing shift work should actually do floating. And I think our culture needs to just come around and hear these athletes being talked about because we still have a little bit of a tough culture and they may look at some of these modalities as woo woo or something silly, but it's really just an incredible environment for you to heal and to feel better and to start to be able to perform better and be a better person in your everyday life.
Yeah, let me read you this. We got a really nice endorsement when we were launching the Maui Calm Project last year from a bunch of firefighters who are using float therapy. And they've agreed to allow me to share these endorsements. But this one's from a fire captain who worked in the Seattle Fire Department. And he said, I've been in the fire service for nearly 30 years and suffer from PTSD due to repeated exposures of traumatic events sustained during my career. I've used many different modalities to help heal from PTSD, and I found that float therapy is very helpful. It is one of the few opportunities to turn off my hypervigilance, my racing thoughts, and the slideshow of past traumas. Too often, current treatments just throw medications at people instead of working on the foundation of fixing the person. I urge anyone suffering from PTSD to try this therapy. I can't imagine my healing journey without it. So I think, it's very powerful. And once again, no one's saying that floating is going to be, the cure-all, end-all for everything. What it is it's the catalyst. It's what helps your nervous system get into a state that allows you to start processing life again, start engaging in life again, right? And then trying other modalities, other therapeutic modalities suddenly become much more useful when you're not in this fight or flight state anymore. And so to me, that's really powerful. We're hearing real world evidence that if you're a first responder or a firefighter, this could be tremendously helpful. And that's one of the neat parts of the Maui Calm Project is we're now going to be offering free float therapy to every single first responder on Maui, including all the firefighters and all the police officers.
That's incredible. What exactly is your Maui Calm project? Is that pretty much what it is? You have a float center out there in Maui, or is there a couple of them, or how is that working?
So when the fires hit a little over a year ago now, it was really a traumatic situation for the entire island. There's multiple fires happening that day. I remember, sitting at a volunteer station with my whole family, my young kids included, and we were just on a conveyor belt trying to feed all the firefighters who had been working 24-hour shifts for weeks trying to put out this fire. And I kind of, went into a moment of despair about a week or two after the fires where I felt so horrible for what had happened and how many lives had been lost, how much destruction had been had during this event. And, I didn't really understand what, I could do to fix it. But I had this epiphany that, what if we could deploy float therapy to Maui inside of shipping containers? Because, when you have to build a float center in a well-calibrated brick and mortar situation, it could take sometimes several years to build and get permitted. And we didn't have several years. This is the biggest, deadliest fire America has seen in a century. And I knew PTSD was going to be starting in the months ahead. We didn't have years to wait for a float center to be built. We needed a float center now. And so ever since then, I've been fighting for this idea. It's called the Maui Calm Project, but the essence of the idea is, can we deploy float therapy rapidly to ground zero in Lahaina by building these specialized facilities inside of shipping containers? And to me, the most critical piece of this equation is, can we make it accessible to the people who need it the most, which are all the first responders and all the people who survived this horrible fire.
That's amazing.
And it was a dream. It was an idea that I came up with in that moment of despair, and I really haven't stopped since. We've been applying for tons of grants. My nonprofit has been trying to spread the word, and finally, at long last, it took a full year to get there. We're going to make it happen. We got a grant from the Hawaii Community Foundation, which runs the Maui Strong Fund, that is going to allow my nonprofit to provide free float therapy to everybody on Maui who needs it. Whether you're a fire survivor, whether you're a first responder, whether you're a frontline worker. Think of all the people that are going to need to rebuild Lahaina. That entire town was destroyed. This is going to be free to all the construction workers that are rebuilding Lahaina. This is going to be free to all the mental health therapists, which we don't have very many on Maui, but they've been inundated with just vicarious trauma, and they need this. The amount of burnout on this island is incredible. The community really stepped up in the throes of this trauma. And if it wasn't for the community stepping up at that moment, I don't know how we survived this thing. But now all those members of the community that have been really coming to help in this moment of need help themselves. The burnout is incredible 1 year post, and the chronic PTSD is starting to really escalate. In fact, when you look at the data from past wildfires, suicide is actually worse on year 2 than year 1. And so I think we're just beginning to process what happened here on Maui. The people, the fire survivors, are just starting to find a little bit of time to be able to even breathe. I think the last people just moved out of the hotels and are starting to finally get some long-term sheltering in place. But we have thousands and thousands of people who lost their home and are trying to understand how they're going to survive right now. So the essence of the Maui Calm Project is we are currently building a really remarkable state-of-the-art float facility inside of a 40-foot high cube shipping container. It's being constructed in England right now by Floataway, which is one of the premier manufacturers of float pools. And these are all going to contain 3 private open float pools, each container, with their own private entry door, their own private shower. We've tried to reduce the barriers to entry for anybody who has stress or anxiety. So one of the things that we use in our research studies that we're now replicating in the Maui Calm Project is open float pools. These have no enclosure. So it's a wide open float pool. We build the room around the pool to have the ability to be light proof and soundproof and temperature and humidity controlled. But by virtue of that, you don't need an enclosure. So imagine essentially a rectangular pool that's around 9 feet long. You could stretch out, do the full Vitruvian Man if you'd like, but no enclosure whatsoever. It reduces the barriers tremendously. On top of that, we've created an infrared light system. So if you want to turn the lights on and off, all you do is wave your arm and the lights will turn on and off. So you don't even have to find the light switch. And then the biggest barrier to entry for float therapy, hands down, is the cost. Right now, if you wanted to float in Hawaii, there's nowhere on Maui that offers it. There's not a single place. The nearest location is actually on the island of Kauai, and it's at this hotel that is charging $200 a float session. Okay? If you go to the mainland, you're looking at anywhere from $50 to $100 a float session. All right? The people who lost everything in this fire would not even be able to afford $5 a float session. They've lost everything. I was just on a call yesterday with all the medical professionals on Maui, and they were talking about how the fire survivors can't even afford a copay for their doctor's appointments. Keep in mind, when they lost everything to the fire, there was no sirens. There was no forewarning. And so the people lost everything. They didn't have time to save anything from their house. So to me, the most critical piece to the whole project is this idea that the float therapy, for the first time ever, will be provided free of charge. And that's what I'm most excited about with Maui Calm, is now we're going to allow an entire community that has been traumatized a tool and access to a tool that has historically been relegated to the upper echelons of society. And now they're going to be able to float as often as they want, completely free of charge. If somebody's finding benefit and they want to float every day and there's openings in our schedule, they could float every day. That is the idea of the Maui Calm Project, is can we create a ripple effect across the entire community of Maui by allowing all the people who are suffering from really unprecedented levels of stress and anxiety the chance to heal in this novel environment. And we're going to study it. We're going to measure outcomes, look at things like the mitigation of PTSD symptoms, see if we could reduce suicidality, see if we could reduce addiction. I'm really worried about the island going into a state of self-medication where alcoholism and opioid addiction and benzo addiction kind of becomes the main coping strategy. I don't want to see that for Maui. So the essence of the Maui Calm Project is we're going to do the first real-world test of what happens when you provide an entire community free access to float therapy. I'm so excited. I hope your listeners could help support this project. You know, we're doing this out of the goodness of our heart. We're trying to make this financially feasible, which is not trivial. It's not trivial to offer free float therapy. So if people would go to our website, mauicalm.org, and please contribute if you can. I would really appreciate it.
Yeah, that's amazing. I'll make sure to put that in the show notes and let it be very accessible for people. That sounds like a lot of work and a beautiful thing to offer people. So I'm sure there's a lot of people suffering right now, and I've heard about the displacement of housing. What a nightmare over there. That's terrible. And the way things have been handled just doesn't sound like it's been too correct. But people like you are doing different things, trying to find housing and trying to figure out solutions. So everybody tries to do their part within their reach. And it sounds like you're doing a heck of a job. So that's awesome.
Yeah, we've come a long ways from the initial genesis of the idea really in the week after the fire to now actually having the float facility built and hopefully here on island by the end of this year. And we already have an amazing spot that we're going to put it right in the heart of Lahaina. And we can't wait. We can't wait to be able to offer this to all the people who really need it right now.
That's awesome. Well, maybe I'll even take a little clip of your description of it and let it be very easily accessible for you to share too with your people. So,
Oh, that'd be great.
yeah. Anything else that sounds like you got your plate full doing that. Or you have anything else coming up that you've been working on with your floating world? Are you doing other projects, or what else is going on in your world?
Yeah, before the fires, my nonprofit was really focused on creating a really large worldwide collaborative research study to study float therapy in the float centers across the world. And we are now getting ready to launch that study next year as well. It's going to be called Project Arcturus, but this project the way we're envisioning it is going to be the largest float study that's ever been done. We already have over 60 float centers that have signed up from America, Canada, Europe, Australia, New Zealand. It's really a worldwide collaboration. And we're going to have, typical, float research from the past few decades ranges from having anywhere from, a small sample size around 10 to 20 people to the largest samples in, the low 100s. What we're trying to do is actually get a sample size in the thousands. And so with Project Arcturus, we now have that opportunity, and we're going to really try to understand what are the clinical conditions that people are using float therapy for out in the wild, if you will, out in the real world. And we're going to really understand what those conditions are, how it's benefiting them, and whether they were able to get off some of their medications because of float therapy. That's something of great interest to my nonprofit. And ultimately, my nonprofit, the Float Research Collective, our North Star is really getting floating approved as an accepted medical treatment, one that is much more accessible to the patients that stand to benefit from it, one that could be prescribed by your doctor, reimbursed by your health insurance provider, or in the case of other countries, just paid for by government subsidized healthcare. So to me, that's my vision for the future of float therapy, is that this is going to be a tool that is accessible to everybody. And it has such profound ripple effects in our society that it is provided essentially free of charge to the people of the world. Because in my view, floating is the antidote to the crazy modern times that we live in, this hyper-connected, hyper-stimulated world that we live in. Floating is the antidote. And my nonprofit is really trying our best to get this approved by the powers that be, because I think it is going to have profound implications for our society when it becomes more accessible.
I love that. It sounds like an amazing vision, and I think it's going to happen. I can see that you're determined, and I can see the benefits are going to be revealed. I've been an evangelical floater for years, and I know I've sent hundreds of people to the local True Rest and Revive You. They're two centers that I have close, and I just love sending people there because I know it works. And so I think people just don't know it exists, and they don't know what it is, and they just need to try it out. So that's awesome. Good work doing all that.
Well, we're getting close. It's kind of interesting having this conversation, Ryan, because you brought me back to where this all started, which was really about a decade ago, 2013. And we've come a long ways from those initial questions of, is this safe? To now, not only is it safe, but it has these tremendous clinical benefits that could have real world implications, right? So you kind of see what happens over the course of a decade of really developing good evidence base, replicable research, right? That's the essence of research. And we've now replicated the anti-anxiety effects of floating over a half dozen times, all published in good peer-reviewed journals. So to me, the evidence base is now accruing to the point where we got to do these real-world studies. And if those real-world studies turn out in the way that we're expecting, then the governments and the healthcare agencies of our time need to take this seriously, because this is a profound clinical tool. It just hasn't been viewed as such historically.
Right. That's amazing. Yeah, I hope it happens because people, that's usually their issue too, is the price point, is the barrier to entry for a lot of folks. It's just too expensive for them, or they don't prioritize it because it's, they got to feed their families or choose other options. So hopefully it can be covered by insurance soon and be prescribed in that way. That's amazing.
So we're getting there. As you've seen with MAPS, this is a marathon, not a race, a sprint. It's going to take many years to get to that vision that I just articulated, but I think the data is going to get us there ultimately. And it's just going to take, I think, a lot of people helping the momentum that we've had over this past decade. When you're a nonprofit, and I can tell you because I started this just a couple of years ago, the biggest part is creating your base, right? Getting your message out, because most people don't even know you exist. And so I appreciate the opportunity, Ryan. It's been super fun doing this podcast, and I'm optimistic that I could come back on here, hopefully sometime in the near future, and be able to tell you about some of these great results that we're seeing with the Maui Calm Project.
Absolutely. I would love that. I'd love to keep updated and have you on any time for sure. And I appreciate you coming on and sharing this story because it's important for people to hear, you know? So, and I
Well,
ask
thank you for
I always ask every guest, pretty much almost everyone, what would you say to the world if you were going to die today?
Hmm. Well, since I was just thinking about this yesterday, I'll use the cheeky quote that John Lennon came up with: "Give peace a chance." You know, yesterday was the 100th birthday of Dr. Arthur Janoff, a good friend of mine, also a psychologist by training. And Art passed away at the age of 93, but one of Art's most famous accomplishments is he actually helped save the life of John Lennon using a treatment that he developed back in the 70s called primal therapy. Also very intense trauma treatment. Really, it's really focused on people who've experienced trauma. And at the time of the Beatles breaking up, Lennon was a real mess. You know, this is all out there, so I'm not saying anything that people don't know about. And you know, everything Art's told me, I want to keep confidential about John Lennon. But Art was John Lennon's psychotherapist for many, many months, where every single day they were meeting, doing this very intensive treatment called primal therapy. And the first album after the Beatles was called John Lennon and the Plastic Ono Band. And that entire album is also referred to as the Primal album because most of the songs on that album are about his experience going through this therapy that Art Janoff put him through. It's really an incredible album to listen to when you have that context. And after the treatment, a lot of John's issues resolved, not all of them, but a lot of them resolved. And he was able to reconnect with himself in a way that he never had prior to that, in a way that allowed him to love himself. A lot of people don't realize, but there's a lot of self-hatred, even in one of the most famous people in the world, arguably one of the biggest musicians of all time, right? A lot of self-criticism, a lot of self-hatred, right? A lot of pain from a lifetime of early trauma. He had a really difficult childhood. And Art helped him reconnect with himself in this positive way that led to amazing creations like the song Imagine, right? I don't think Imagine would have ever been written if John Lennon didn't go through this intensive therapy with Art. So anyways, I answer your question, you know, partially in honor to my friend Art, who would have turned 100 years old yesterday, and say, give peace a chance, because I think so many of us are burnt out. So many of us are facing really unprecedented levels of stress and anxiety in our life. Right now, at this moment, more so than any other point in life. And I know the American way is, you know, pick yourself up by the bootstrap and just keep going, 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 going. But at a certain point, you got to give peace a chance. You got to allow yourself to slow down. You got to allow yourself the time to introduce practices like float therapy into your life, and breath work and meditation. And if you give peace a chance, I promise you, your nervous system will be receptive to it. So in my final parting words, I leave you with the words of someone much wiser than myself. And I encourage all of your listeners to give peace a chance.
I appreciate that. That's a beautiful message. It's always easier to get busy than it is to be still and slow down. So that's amazing. Yeah. Thank you for your time. And I look forward to connecting with you in the future. And if you ever need anything, reach out and I'll make sure to share your message with at least the people within my reach.
Thank you, Ryan. Really appreciate it and look forward to doing this again.
Yeah, me too. Thank you. Thank you for listening to the episode. Be sure to subscribe to the show on Spotify, YouTube, and iTunes and rate the show. I hope you enjoyed the episode.